you looking forward to Space Marine 2 or interested in it, but you're also not really a 40k lore head? Is Space Marine 2 going to be your first introduction into the 40k universe? Are you worried about understanding what's going on in the game? Don't worry, that's why I'm here. I'm gonna break down everything you need to know to be ready for Space Marine 2. To make sure that everyone's up to speed, we're first going to go over the story of the first Space Marine game, then talk about who the Ultramarines and Captain Titus are, as well as some of the background lore and context of the greater 40k universe, and wrap up by filling in the little bits we do know about what's taken place between the events of the first game and Space Marine 2. There's gonna be some things we cover that maybe even some of you seasoned veterans might not know, so let's jump in and hit the ground running. Obey my cat! Hit the subscribe button. The first Space Marine game takes place on a forge world called Graia that's been all but overwhelmed by a massive orc wog of at least 1 million combined orc forces, including squigs, grots, Gretchen, and of course boys of various kinds themselves. Planetary destruction isn't an option to stop the invasion because Manufactura Majacis is located here, which produces warlord titans, making it far too valuable of a planet to annihilate through exterminatus. The approach to saving Graia that stands the most chance of tactical success is a full-scale counterattack by the Imperial Navy, but it will take them too long to arrive before the planet is overrun with orcs, and Warboss Grimskull takes over a warlord-class titan in Manufactura Majacis. To buy enough time for the Navy to arrive, the Ultramarines are deployed to intervene. Enter our main character, Captain Titus, and his two beloved battle brothers, Veteran Sergeant Sidonis, aka Anthony Hopkins, and Leandros, who graduated from the Skywalker Finishing School of Whining. Together, these Ultramarines land on the planet, strike superhero poses, and start pimp-slapping the ever-living Emperor out of every last green-skinned Xenos on the planet. And it's here I'd like to take a moment for us to be grateful that Tyranids don't talk. Because could you imagine what that would sound like? But back to the story. Titus meets total badass and certified hottie Lieutenant Mira, who is the only known officer left alive on the planet of the 203rd Cadian Shock Troop Regiment, and she tells him that they have reinforcements waiting in orbit that are unable to bring human meat shields and other supplies down to the surface because the Orks have taken over the big-ass planetary defense gun, which makes Titus concerned that Warboss Grimskull is smarter than the average orc. So the captain and friends make their way to the big gun and blow it up so the tactical human sacrifices can make it down to the planet. Then the three amigops head down to Manufactura Majacis to stop the orcs from taking over any of the slightly smaller but still quite large walking guns. God damn it, Titans are so cool. As they head into the facility, they encounter a servo skull with a Princess Leia-style distress message from an Inquisitor named Drogon of the Ordo Xenos. His message is that the orcs are getting close to taking over an experimental weapon he was working on, and the war boss needs to be stopped before he can get his hands on it. The Ultramarines definitely agree with that assessment, seeing as that's the entire reason they're here, and slap around some more orcs while searching the facility for the Inquisitor. They find Drogon a bit worse for wear. He's got a gaping chest wound which is no longer bleeding, and he insists is fine, surely not a red flag at all, and informs the Space Marines that he was on the planet when the invasion began, performing research on an experimental weapon that can wipe out the orcs he calls a psychic scourge. To get the scourge to work, he needs his warp-based power supply to generate the field that will send an energy blast across the planet that's attuned to the specific orc psychic wavelength and pop their heads, leaving humans untouched. Or blow the planet apart. Either way, problem solved. Titus is sent into an isolated chamber where the power supply is being held and comes under fire by Xenos enemies. He fends off the attack and reaches the power supply, which is super unstable, and puts off a massive energy surge once the captain touches it, annihilating all orcs in the area and reducing the chamber to rubble. Inquisitor Drogon is certain Titus must be dead, because no one can come into direct contact with warp energy and survive, even an Ultramarine. Titus, however, couldn't care less about this diagnosis and continues living anyway. He meets up with the rest of his battle brothers, and Leandros is extremely unhappy because the Codex Astartes says that anyone who comes into direct contact with warp energy and live must be touched by chaos, so Captain Titus must be a heretic. Anthony Hopkins tells him to shut his face because there must be some other explanation, and they all continue on to take the power supply to the Psychic Scourge weapon itself, while Andros pouts and probably mutters to himself about how the Codex Astartes says he's way cooler than Titus. They make it to the weapon, Titus inserts the power core and gets the system up and running, and the Psychic Scourge is fired at the nearby orbital spire, used as a focal point, sending a shockwave of energy across the planet that destroys the Orks, and the day is saved! Just kidding. It isn't actually a weapon at all. It opens a Chaos Gate and fucking blood letters of Khorne come pouring out of the warp rift, along with a Chaos Sorcerer called Nemeroth, and this was actually exactly Inquisitor Drogon's plan all along, the traitorous bastard. Well, kind of. See, Inquisitor Drogon was actually dead the entire time because of that previously mentioned gaping chest wound thing. He was killed by a demon of the warp because he really was experimenting with that mysterious warp energy that he calls the power source, and succumbed to the classic folly of fuck around and find out. Said demon had been meat puppeting his body around with the mission to open a warp gate and lead his master Nemeroth to the planet. Luring the Ultramarines to Graia had always been part of Nemeroth's master plan as well, as he knew they would be necessary to get the power source into his own hands. So Nemeroth uses his chaos powers to control all the Ultramarines, but Titus is a special blueberry that can kind of resist his power, leading Nemeroth to be intrigued and speculate that the captain must be warp touched. And I'm assuming they cut out the part where Leandros yells from the background, "I fucking told you!" Thankfully, Warboss Grimskull shows up and tackles Nemeroth, and they both go hurtling off a ledge. Titus, Sidonis, and Leandros get up and dust off their armor, and the captain hatches the plan to use the brand spanking new Warlord Titan back at Manufactorum Majakas to blast the spire used as the focal point where the Chaos Gate opened, so it will force it closed. But to get to the Walking Fortress, Titus first has to exterminate Grimskull once and for all. Once the Warboss is dead, the Orks begin their retreat off the planet, leaving only the menacing forces of chaos left for the Ultramarines to deal with. Titus makes it back to the Manufactorum, and the Titan is powered up using the warp energy source he brought with him from where the Psychic Scourge was fired. It unleashes a devastating blast into the orbital spire, closing the warp rift, and Titus leaves the power source in the care of Sidonis to get it off planet, as he knows it's what Nemeroth is after. Then he and Leandros head off to distract and dispatch the Dark Soldiers while Sidonis escapes. And of course, this plan finally goes off perfectly without a hitch, and that's the end of the game. No, Anthony Hopkins! Yeah, Titus isn't pleased about this, and Nemeroth gets his grubby heretic claws on the power source and heads back up to the top of Evil HQ, intending to use the power source as an offering to get ascended into a powerful being called a demon prince blessed by the chaos gods themselves. Mira tells Titus to believe in the warp resistance within him and the power of friendship and use it to kick Nemeroth's ass. So Titus sets off with this new goal in mind, and he gets a little backup from the Blood Ravens because, yeah, sure, why not? They're here now too, I guess. Captain Titus fights his way to the top of the spire and confronts Nemeroth, stopping his ascension to full demon princehood. And the final boss fight against the actual boss of the game is a fucking quick time event where you fall down the spire, and I know this isn't a review, but not being able to shoot that smug Harvey Dent knockoff in his stupid chaos face gave me some of the worst blue balls I have ever received in a video game. Nemeroth gets his skull crushed in, Titus survives, and returns to Mira and Leandros. As they're together tending to Titus's wounds, a ship full of Sisters of Battle show up and throw Titus a party and tell him what a great job he's done. Just kidding again. It's the Black Templars and an Inquisition of the Ordo Malleus named Thrax, who asks Leandros if he's certain about the accusations he's made against his captain. Leandros says he is, and Thrax informs Titus that he's under arrest on suspicion of being a heretic. Titus squares up and says, "Bitch, what if I don't?" To which Thrax replies that if he doesn't go willingly, Thrax will have no choice but to take everyone that has assisted Titus throughout his time on Graia, including Mira and all of the Imperial Guard. Titus relents to protect them, and he tells Leandros he's very disappointed in him, because even though the Codex Astartes may say he's a traitor, what really makes a Space Marine a real man is his ability to weigh the rules against the most important thing of all: what's in your own Codex Astartes. I'm sorry, I know that was terrible. Titus is taken away, and Leandros pouts because his father figure isn't proud of him for turning him into the Inquisition. And that's the end of the game! Okay, so now that we know what literally happens in Space Marine 1, what the heck does any of that mean? I'm glad you asked. Let me just start off by saying the Orks are kind of incidental to the overall core story of Space Marine. They're mostly just a vehicle to get Titus onto Graia in the first place and then give the player some fodder to slap around so the game doesn't blow its chaos load right away. So we're not really going to talk about the Orks at all. I know, I'm sorry. Since they're obviously the main characters throughout the entire game, first up, let's talk about who are the Ultramarines. The Ultramarines are a Space Marine Legion that were the 13th of the original 20 legions founded before the events of the Horus Heresy. Ultramarines are considered the poster boys of Space Marines. They're supposed to be incredibly disciplined and have steadfast dedication to the teachings of their Primarch Rabute Guilliman, and they've been this way for more than 10,000 years since the events of the Heresy. After the Horus Heresy, Rabute Guilliman wrote the Codex Astartes, which is that book Leandros is always referencing. He wrote it for a few different reasons, some of which was really to reinforce the moral and ethical behaviors expected of a Space Marine loyal to the Imperium, and to outline proper and efficient battle tactics, but the biggest reason was to completely restructure the Space Marine legions. Rabute wanted to effectively compartmentalize the original 20 legions into smaller chapters, and make it less likely that enough of them would ever fall to chaos at once ever again and cause another catastrophe like the Horus Heresy. And that makes a lot of sense if you consider that at minimum, there was somewhere in the ballpark of 2 million Space Marines across 20 legions before Horus had his mega tantrum, and around 1 million that used to be loyal Space Marines ultimately were seduced and turned to chaos. So what was once a force of 20 legions was reduced into about half, and those remaining loyalists were broken down into 1,000 chapters of 1,000 men each, which is how we went from having just under 24 legions to memorize to roughly a bajillion that all of us has one we're really specifically into but no one else has ever heard of, like the Howling Griffins or the Tarantulas. These are called successor chapters, so when you see 40k memes that say, "Get that man a successor chapter," if you didn't before, now you know what the heck that means. But yeah, the Codex Astartes is basically the Space Marine Bible written by the Ultramarine head honcho himself, and it's not uncommon for the Ultramarines to take its written word very seriously and do everything they can to make sure their every action represents the best and most virtuous pinnacle any Space Marine should aspire to be, which puts it into perspective why Leandros is such a bitch. Now, Titus, being the captain of the Ultramarine 2nd Company, specifically actually used to put the events of Space Marine 1 outside of the 40k canon, because it was in question whether or not it conflicted with the time during which the 2nd Company would have had another captain by the name of Cato Sicarius. However, Space Marine 2 sets up Captain Titus to have been held in stasis for over 100 years, pushing the events of Space Marine 1 back to have taken place before a time Cato Sicarius was captain, correcting the canon conflict. You may be wondering, if Captain Titus was taken away by Inquisitor Thrax to be interrogated as a possible heretic, how is he the main character of Space Marine 2? Well, that's a bit of a complicated story, but the short of it is that Thrax has it out for Space Marines. He doesn't trust them and believes that their incredible power and the fact so many of them have turned to chaos over the centuries makes them a threat to the humans of the Imperium. He subjected Titus to incredible torment of unfathomable pain for over 100 years, keeping him in stasis and taking him out every now and then to question over and over again. Thrax never found a single sign of heresy in Titus, but never relented that he thought it must be the only way Titus was able to withstand the subjugation Nemeroth tried to put him under using the powers of the warp. Thrax was eventually killed after being possessed by a demon, ironic, and eventually Titus and other Space Marines were discovered held in stasis. Titus was freed, but his brothers of the Ultramarines were never informed, and he lived under the assumption that the Ultramarines never came to retrieve him because he had shamed his chapter. He decided to take on the name Nullus and never have his previous service revealed to anyone, and ended up taking up with the Death Watch with the intention of going on what were effectively suicide missions until it finally came to pass that he'd die in service of the Emperor. Which, come on dude, could you be more dramatic? Just call somebody and ask them what's happening. Eventually, Titus was deployed to a Tyranid-infested planet where he was fatally wounded by a Carnifex and was bleeding out on the planet's surface, ready to die. But as fate had it, a strike team of Ultramarines were actually on their way to that same planet to back up the Death Watch, and the librarian on board their ship recognized Titus's unique soul imprint as a former captain of the Ultramarines. Titus was brought on board their ship, and to save him from the brink of death, he underwent a grueling surgical procedure that turned him into an even stronger kind of Space Marine known as a Primaris, which he survived. arrived. Titus was welcomed back into the Ultramarines, though because he'd been absent for so long at a lower rank. The fact there are those who still are mistrustful of him because of the mysterious nature of his resistance to the influence of chaos may have also played a role, but ultimately Lieutenant Demetrian Titus of the Ultramarines 2nd Company has been cleared of any wrongdoing and ready for service once more. Which brings us more or less to the opening of Space Marine 2. I'm excited to see if we learn any more about Titus and the mysterious nature of his resistance to chaos, and also why Tzeentch is interfering in events this time. But more than anything, I'm looking forward to getting covered from head to toe in Tyranid gore. Wanna hang out, play together, and maybe get some PvP matches in? Drop us up on this channel and watch for my streams coming this week, because I'm going to be playing Space Marine 2 a lot. Like a lot. Oh, and thanks for watching. Love you nerds, bye! Holy crap, I have so many people to thank this time. Thank you to Leah S over on Patreon for helping make this video possible, and also thank you to YouTube channel members Rue on Top, Van Goose, Wendy Bergeron, Catfish, Adam L, Greg Burrow, Sir Pubert, Helios, and John Cousins. You guys, your support means the world to me, truly and sincerely. So thank you so much for continuing to support this channel and helping make it possible that I actually can still do this and make content.